We need to tolerate other opinions, and inclusion can hurt. There is this experiment formed 4 groups. In one of the group, he planted a devil's advocate, a person who would always go against the rest of the group. Basically say, no, but we haven't considered that. But what about this? It led to that group actually outperforming the others. Now, in a second iteration of the experiment, they asked all the members of the group to vote out one of the members. In most cases, they voted out the devil's advocate. This idiot that you're dealing with in your office, but that keeps bringing up pretty valid points. He is an enrichment of your work environment. If you manage to establish a culture and values which value that, which empower people and values dissent, I think you can unleash incredible power in your organization. But it's that goes back to actually doing stuff versus just writing policies, right?
Yeah.
That is so far from how diversity and inclusion was understood, even up to now, right? That is diversity inclusion that creates really financial value.
Patrick, I'm very excited to have you on the Core Impact podcast. Excited because we're going to dive into many topics. On the one side, for example, strategy, sustainability, and change management. On the other side, sustainability reporting and the future of finance. But before we dive into these topics, I would like to know from you, what is your inner motivation to speak, teach, and write about sustainability and decision-making under uncertainty?
Yeah. Omar, thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. What is my inner motivation? That is a great question. About writing and teaching. I mean, that has generally been something I've always loved to do. I've always loved writing. Since I was a small child. Writing has always been a method for me to structure my thinking and learn. And it's very much also teaching or public speaking is very much the same, especially public speaking. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm necessarily particularly well suited to do it. I'm more of a private person. But the great thing about public speaking is that when you prepare, really need to think through your arguments and how you're going to put them in a way that people understand. And it's the same with teaching, right? You need to kind of see the world from the shoes of your students or course participants, and you need to sort of think about, so what might they think about this? How do they look at this? How do I need to frame this to make it clear? I think in its core, it's about sharing my view on things in a way so others can access it and appreciate it if they find it interesting. And why do I write about sustainability and growth and strategy? And the background of that is really that I've always had an interest in sustainability, or at the beginning, sustainable investing. I have worked all my career in financial services, particularly in the asset management industry, and there, much more than in any other areas, sustainable investing was kind of a thing way before it became a mass phenomenon with the whole regulation that started. I'd say about roughly 10 years ago. And I've always been interested, but I didn't kind of do much work on it. But when the regulatory wave really started, I started focusing on it more. I built up an entire advisory team in one of the big four in Switzerland around it. But I think there was one big frustration in my mind, which was that the whole topic was purely compliance and reporting driven. What bothered me about it is that there was this kind of just assumption or notion that if companies report transparently on sustainability, then somehow magically capital flows will reallocate and it will finally pay to be sustainable, and there will be long-term strategic advantages and things like that. And for a sustainability person, I've always been kind of more commercially minded. That has probably to do with the fact that my background is in audit, and later I did a lot of regulatory advice. And I'm also maybe a bit more science minded. So I was always thinking, well, what is exactly going to be the mechanism by which this will work? And nobody was really able to explain that to me. And even to the contrary, I noticed that there was potentially even some harm being done because I met all these loads of people enthusiastically working on on these huge reporting projects, and with sort of the expectation to really make an impact. And now turned out that this was not the case, which I think is really lamentable. So I started asking myself how this really works. How is this sustainable transformation, or how is this transition really going to work? Why isn't it progressing? What are the challenges we need to overcome? About 2 years ago, I got in touch with somebody who introduced me to complexity science and complexity economics, and this was a momentous point for me, because there I really, for the first time, became aware of an entire scientific field which held the promise of actually coming up with a reasonable and science-based answer of how all this could work, and why things don't work as they should right now. And I've been hooked ever since, and I've been using my writing, as I just alluded to at the beginning, to kind of advance my own thinking process, and equally kind of to invite opinions from others into this discussion, because probably the thing I am the most frustrated about is how politicized the sustainability topic has become. And both sides raise valid concerns. But because there is this kind of gridlock right now, so you're either a liberal or you're a conservative, and if you're a liberal, you ought to have these opinions, and if you're a conservative, you ought to have these opinions. I don't see the topic moving forward, and that is the core motivation of why I started my newsletter, The Adaptive Edge, which is kind of to offer a new perspective of how this topic could be understood and advanced beyond kind of purely political agendas.
Patrick, now I'm reflecting. I remember you wrote about this interconnectedness, how important it is, because it was also my experience, because I was one of the reasons that were affected you were talking about. I was working also in audit and financial roles before, and then I moved to sustainability reporting. And now out of it, among other things, because of the changes in the regulations and everything. But maybe we start with this interconnectedness, because when I saw in practice companies focusing on just being compliant with this reporting, there were lots of things missing in practice, and also even in the doing the reporting in a really transparent way. What do you like to mention here?
Yeah. So I mean, interconnectedness is a huge topic, right? But starting from the particular topic of sustainability reporting, I think the the key point about interconnectedness is that there is this notion out there that companies can be sustainable irrespective of the industry that they operate in, irrespective of how they're funded, and generally irrespective of the broader context they operate in. And I think that is the fundamental issue here, right? That sustainability is seen as something that a firm on its own can achieve, which is not true, and that is why, which I later then kind of realized is also why transparency alone can never I mean does contribute to sustainability. Transparency is important, and it is important that what companies report is accurate, but we cannot simply assume that just because companies report, somehow the world is going to change, because the way to the sustainable transition, there are so many other factors to consider which hinder or support this transition, and transparency is merely one out of many aspects of it. The EU, at least kind of on the European level, has underestimated that, right? That also regulation on many other parts of the system needs to be adapted as well in order to progress transition. I think there are many other aspects to talk about interconnectedness, but that is a particularly important point, speaking particularly in the context of reporting.
You mentioned, Patrick, also that you found out in the last 2 years specifically how could this work. But before we start talking about how it could work, let's start with what didn't work, or how do you see, first of all, the development of the sustainability reporting or regulations in the last few years, and talk about the issue of there were lots of pushbacks either from companies or also from the regulations.
Yes, there are very valid arguments on both sides, right? So the reporting requirements that were introduced prior to Omnibus, so CSRD, I mean, they were massive. They were never, it was something like never seen. And as quickly as the requirements emerged, they disappeared, right? I wouldn't say that the substance of the requirements were necessarily wrong, but what I'm saying is that what is clearly harmful is this erratic behavior of the regulation, right? Because and that is pretty much common knowledge, right? Companies want predictability. Companies want stability. And there are even studies out there which say exactly that actually what results to costs or economic damage or even slows down the transition is not whether you have lenient environmental policies or strict environmental policies. What causes the harm and damage is actually if you switch back and forth between the two, because companies don't know. Companies have to keep changing their compliance setups. Companies have to have uncertainties about whether they should invest or not. And that is what we clearly have seen also in Europe, this erratic behavior. So, I mean, that's always easy to say in hindsight, right? But maybe a more wiser approach to take in the future, let's formulate it like that, is to maybe start in waves, but start with the big companies, do that for a couple of years, then another wave, then maybe a third wave, then maybe look at the content of what needs to be reported, whether it's too much, it's too little, if there needs to be changes, right? There should be a constant evolution in the regulation. And in that regard, I'm Swiss, and I have to say Switzerland has maybe inadvertently taken a much better stand in just taking a more measured approach to the whole thing, right? I think that is kind of my key insight here. That is, I neither approve or disapprove of what the reporting requirements were about, but what was definitely harmful is the process by which they were introduced and are now kind of dismantled again. Because I think CSRD had its weakness and advantages, but the regulation deserved to be in place for a couple of years and see how it all plays out, and then do a review of the whole thing.
Patrick, you said that you are particularly concerned with why good strategies backfire. One is why optimization creates fragility. And the second also question that I picked is why organizations respond too late to signals that were visible all along. Let's start with the first one, optimization. Optimization creates fragility. And maybe also you can link it directly with sustainability.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, the mindset of from the first implementation, everything should be perfect, right?
Yeah. My writing about this is based on one central premise, which is that in today's environment, well, not only today's, actually, I mean, it's been like this for like forever. But in the complex environment that we are operating, it is a fallacy to believe that you can predict where the world is going for anything but the shortest of terms. So you could have a strategy for maybe the next 6 months or maybe the next 12 months, and you could maybe assume where things are going. But beyond that, in most environments, not in all, to be fair, not all industries are are dynamic in the same way, right? I'm also writing about the Catholic Church has, in terms of adaptability, finds a different environment than, for example, a telecom company. But still, in most industries, there seems to be a notion that what creates long-term strategic advantages is the best strategy, but that is not true. So there is, in fact, no such thing as a long-term strategic advantage. The best you can hope for, and the book Built to Last by Collins and Poros is really the best resource I know on that. The best you can hope for is that you can manage to repeatedly create short-term strategic advantages. And that requires adaptive capacity. And adaptive capacity is something that is very different from being perfectly optimized, right? So maybe let me explain that briefly. In biology, this is a very well-known fact that ecosystems are going through an ongoing cycle of growth and prosperity. During this phase of growth and prosperity, the complexity and interconnectedness increases, and to some point that the system becomes unstable. The reason why that has to do with the interconnectedness is that if something happens in one part of the system, it kind of ripples through the entire system because of these manifold connections, and that from outside looks like rigidity, but it is not really rigidity. It's not really rigidity. The system is just so connected that it is unable to move, and then the system either collapses, or through external influences it may enter a new cycle. The complexity science has found that these very same dynamics apply also to social systems such as societies, governments, and companies. And just kind of the drivers there are different, because traditional economic theory assumes that optimization is good because it creates wealth. And that is true to an extent. But what it does is that it basically gets rid. Optimization means first of all, you get rid of all the excess capacity you have by laying off people, or you outsource all the stuff that you do not consider as crucial or central to your business activity, which creates additional complexity because you have more kind of companies, individuals flying around the company, which you need to coordinate with. And that creates especially a problem when the market is going through a transition. So a transition doesn't necessarily need to be related to the climate transition. It could also be related to a complete shift in customer demand, or it could be a fundamental shift in the regulatory environment. And then in such circumstances, you have become so interconnected or for the lack of a better word, rigid, that you're unable to adapt. Because your company has become too complex to manage, and you disappear, right? And this is one of kind of the fundamental insights I have had when I was reflecting on, because I've seen so many kind of sustainable companies which were harming the planet, and which weren't necessarily very successful in business. And I was thinking, why is that? What is really the relationship between sustainability and business success? Because in my mind, a sustainable company had to live potentially or be able to exist forever. Because all those transition plans, all those diversity and inclusion programs, all those charity projects you support, if the company goes bust, that's all for nothing, right? So that is why I started to think, why is it really that companies fail, and why is it that very few companies don't? And the core insight from kind of my research and reading is really that those are the companies that have existed for a very long time, have been able to intentionally and purposefully manage this cycle of avoiding to become too rigid, right? They have been able to continuously re-innovate themselves.
Why organizations respond too late to signals?
Yeah, why they respond too late? Yeah. So why they respond too late is, I mean, it's basically related to this interconnectedness. So I mean, even mathematically speaking, right? As a company grows, as a company gets more employees, more departments, the number of interactions every individual would have to coordinate with the others grows substantially. What do you do about that? Hierarchy. So by introducing hierarchy, you can actually manage this process. Now, this is actually a fundamental trade-off in complex system, that as a company grows, its capacity to do more complex things increases, but its ability to do them decreases. When a company introduces way more hierarchies, it takes much longer for information to travel to the right people, namely the C-suite or the board. And this is obviously in very dynamic environments that is fatal, right? Because if things move fast and it takes 3 months for relevant information to travel from the front lines to the decision makers, you simply won't have the time. So this is basically a fundamental governance question that people need to think about. How can I grow while at the same time still remain nimble and adaptable for when things change? The fundamental issue with that is that markets behave inconsistently. So means markets, not only financial markets, but any other markets, they're usually prolonged periods of stability, followed by extreme volatility. This pattern has been proven to emerge for hundreds of years in the data. And in phases of stability, companies have a bias towards optimizing because it's rational. And that is where they then lose their adaptive capacity when then and are unprepared when the next volatile period of volatility hits.
While you are listening to the Core Impact podcast, please take a moment to pause and share with me. How do you feel? Are you enjoying the conversation, feeling inspired, or something else? I would love to know your feelings in the comments. So it's all interconnected, actually. And this point that I would like to mention here is about a story, a moment in your career when you realize that traditional linear strategy thinking doesn't work in complex systems. A moment in your career or during a project that shifted you, and then you said, that was something that I know after this, I will change my career based on that.
I can think of kind of this aha moment straight away. It's not really in a specific moment in an interaction with a company, but it happened in fact when I read when I read the first book about complexity science, and so the background was that professionally I had been working on transition plans, like like the actual technical work of putting together a carbon balance sheet, and then actually decide, so how are we going to get to the 2030 interim target, how are we going to get to 2050, and then actually coming up with these transition plans. And although I wasn't that familiar with complexity science at that point, it didn't feel right to me. Like, how is this even possible to be able to predict where your emissions are going to move for the next 30 years? Because for financial institutions, it's quite different. But if I'm thinking of corporates, right? Because there is so much things which are going to happen in those 30 years, technological advancements, regulatory changes. Some of them might stall progress. Some of them might massively accelerate it. And then because of this whole greenwashing discussion that was coming up at the time, it was even considered greenwashing if you were over your curve that you had come up with, or below. And I was more like, I mean, surely must be greenwashing if you're exactly on the curve, because the likelihood of that happening would be almost zero. But anyway, I mean, there was no doubt about the fact that that was just kind of the zeitgeist, and this was regarded as best practice and all that. But still, I mean, if I'm honest, a lot in my exchanges with the C-suite, I got a lot of pushback on exactly those points, right? So there was clearly an uneasiness around about exactly that, and then I met this person, and she recommended this book to me called The Myth of the Goal: Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned. What the authors are basically describing in there is that innovation cannot be planned, because innovation and in fact transitions cannot be planned, because where things go depends on how the actors move. The actor A may go that way, which makes actor B go that way, which makes actor C go that way, which triggers this regulation, and so forth, right? So it's a process basically of co-creation. And especially as a single firm, it is impossible to know where this is going. It may go in a desired direction, but how it's actually going to happen, it's impossible to know. It's like it was impossible to know where Amazon and Google's business models were going to go at some point, because it was always going to depend how the specific actors were going to move. And that was a really, like, that was hit me like a hammer. That was a really core insight for me, because there in this book, for the very first time, they actually pointed towards a scientific basis of how these processes work and why it was very unlikely, or not only unlikely, but potentially harmful, that transition plan would work in the way that many companies were setting them up.
Mm. And you talk about uncertainty, and we said you cannot plan most of the times more than 6 to 12 months ahead. It is something related also in business that I find it funny when still companies ask candidates, like, where do you see yourself exactly in the next 5 years, or sometimes even more?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. In many cases, there's still this strong notion that we are in control, right? But whereas in other places not, right? So if somebody would say, I plan to fall in love in the next 2 years, you'd be like, what? Or I plan to win the lottery in the next 2 years. So that is an absurd thought, and there is still fairly little awareness that whether you want to fall in love or whether you want to do the green transition, the underlying mechanisms are actually fairly similar.
uh,
That is why decision quality is important, right? Because I'm not saying that it's futile to plan the transition, but what you can do is, like, if you want to fall in love, right? So if you want to fall in love, just staying at home and gaming Fortnite every evening and the weekend, that's probably not the greatest way to go about it, right? So you're gonna go out. Maybe you're gonna meet some blind dates. You're gonna go where lots of people are. You're gonna ask her for. So there's a whole lot that you could do, which is a promising approach to fall in love
mm,
eventually,
mm,
and other things which are not. And it's the same with the transition, right? There are many things which actually make a lot of sense, and if they work, could get you there, and others that don't. So specifically with regard to the transition, and there has been actually a pretty interesting report from the European Central Bank about structural barriers to the transition in Europe, right? So I don't want to go into detail too much, but basically the European Central Bank identified 7 structural barriers to why the transition is not happening or is delayed.
mm,
Um, so therefore, that gives you already a roadmap, right? So if obviously not all barriers are equally relevant for all the industries, but at least that gives you an idea. Aha, so if I want to do that transition, then I need to overcome this and this and this barrier. Therefore, this and this and this action is a sensible approach to take to get there, versus that and that and that action not. Um, whether it's going to happen in the end is then a completely different question. Um, Probably it's going to happen, but not when and exactly how you planned it, but it's eventually going to happen. So my argument is basically that there should be more focus on the quality of the decisions and not the outcomes. Whereas in today's world, we have a bit of a bias to focus entirely on the outcome
mm,
and not on the decision that underlied it, because very often turns out, but we don't really talk much about that. If a specific outcome is achieved, we simply assume that it must be related to something that was done before, but
mm,
that is not always a prudent thing to assume. So in terms of ensuring that companies are not slacking away or greenwashing, what I advocate is really, like, look at what actual actions, programs, governance are actually implemented, and whether these are sensible to achieve the transition, but not where exactly on their little curve they sit, because it could be they're a bit above in the next 3 years, and then suddenly some new technology comes up, or more like, that's actually not really likely to happen, that technologies emerge out of the blue. It might more be that existing technologies suddenly becomes viable, and then we'll see a strong drop, and that's just as fine. It's just the notion that we are not in control of the outcome goes so much against the debate around climate change and climate protection that it's almost a dirty thing to say, but
Yeah.
I think to acknowledge that we cannot control the outcome doesn't mean that there is nothing we can do about climate change. There's a whole thing we can do. There's a whole thing we should do. But in a way that doesn't cause or that minimizes unintended consequences.
Patrick, of course, there's lots of complexity in regulations. That's something that we know. At the same time, when there's like lots of extra pushback from CEOs or leaders in general, what do you think the things that they are worrying about, but they are still underneath the surface and they don't say out loud? Is there anything that you think they don't like to admit something other than the complexity itself?
And that is a very interesting question because I think we need to acknowledge that the whole the whole interaction between the private sector and regulation about how regulation is made, that is to an extent also a game. Because and it shows in the fact that companies in the most cases actually welcome regulation.
Okay.
And also what they particularly welcome is consistent regulation globally. However, what I consistently observe is that in practice, companies implement regulation inconsistently globally. They will always tend towards the minimum standard that is present in each country which they operate. And there's one simple reason for that discrepancy. The people who kind of are active or speak to the regulators are different people than the ones who implement it. So that is also something that is probably an application case of something that I write about a lot, which is that activities on the micro level can lead to surprising and undesired outcomes on the macro level. It's an effect called emergence in complexity science. So because if you're in a company and you're working in public policy, it is completely irrational from your perspective as a public policy advisor to request global standards, because you're looking at your own company from an kind of an overarching perspective, very similar to the CEO who thinks, okay, we operate in these countries, and if we're going to have to implement this, we would like to do it consistently throughout the whole entire organization, because arguably this is the most efficient way. Completely irrational. However, from the perspective of, let's say, a country manager given in a given location of that company, if he sees actually the local implementation of that rule is less complex than what the kind of what the global standard or what the global consensus is, it is completely rational that you go for the easier, more pragmatic local implementation, right? And that is simply a consequence of different people with different incentives and different motivations operating inside a company. There are lots of people who assume kind of malign intent here, but I'm less sure of that. I think it's simply different actors acting rationally from their own perspectives. And for me, I used to get a bit worked up about that, because because it was really like I couldn't get my head around it, because obviously I worked in regulation for a very long time. I led lots of regulatory implementation projects, and there was always this pressure that we had to, if the rules were different in different places, we had to consider that. And it was really difficult for me to understand. But when these rules were drafted, I know for a fact that your CEO said you want a global standard. So then why don't we do that? But I have a different perspective on that.
Mm. There is another article I find very interesting that you wrote, titled is "Has Sustainability Reporting Gone Bananas?"
Yeah.
And then you also report that financial reporting focuses on the short-term financial resilience, while sustainability reporting should take the longer lens and deal with long-term business resilience. What do you think needs to change in the mindset about sustainability reporting, if there is something that we haven't talked about yet regarding this article?
In the mindset of reporting, I mean, as I said, right, about connected systems. So the solution to the problem is rarely ever one actor changing something. However, I mean, if we were to start with reporting, right, I think what I think could be a valid road to take is to focus more on what I call decision quality. It is to put more focus on what is actually like what is actually implemented, and why, and for what purpose. And I would see all the quantitative information, all the KPIs, kind of then as pure context information to that, because from my perspective, like, put your money where your mouth is, right? So if rather than coming up with very complicated complication of how your carbon footprint is going to behave in the next 30 years, maybe write about, so what are the basic hurdles for you to decarbonize your business model? What's in the way? Is it a certain regulation? Is it lock-in? What do you do to reduce dependency on that? How do you engage with other actors in the market to move things forward? How do you, if it's about kind of my machinery is still good for another 10 years, like, but then what do you do in the meantime? Like, how are you going to make sure that, for example, in your capital allocation processes, like, how do you make sure that as you replace them, you're going to go for more energy efficient models and things like that? It's really less about programs, and it's more about actions. And also, I mean, particularly in sustainability reporting, I think this whole framing that we discussed before with industries over optimizing and becoming rigid as a result. I think there should be much more focus on these risks, because this mechanism is a source of systemic risk. So risks which have the potential to wipe out the business model of a company. And therefore, what I would wish for is more focus on how companies deal with those sort of tail risks, those low probability but high impact risks. How are you preparing for that? What actions are you taking now to prepare for that? I mean, ultimately, and this is where now the whole discussion of the whole sort of ecosystem needs to change, is ultimately all these things are going to cost you a lot of money in the short term, but in the long term will result in your company being more resilient, and potentially also more successful, because when your competitors are going down and you're the last one standing, then all the clients are coming to you. So I would love to see more of that in reporting, but yeah, I mean, as I write in the article, there are a lot of challenges in the way of that happening.
Can you share also maybe a story from the financial sector, because this is what you also concentrate on, where a company shifted to this in the end adaptive and resilient thinking?
I wish I could.
I mean, also you should not name.
I mean, no, I mean, I'm not being
You mean
funny. I
okay?
just, I really,
There is no
I
story.
couldn't.
Okay.
I like, I mean, I hear stories here and there of companies who are applying such methods besides others, but like, even from the books I'm reading, I couldn't really tell. I mean, maybe the only one, and that's a quite interesting one. So this is a case study that is published in the book The Biology of Business. It's it's a very interesting book, a little bit academic, but it basically, it assumes that a company is a complex adaptive system, and it explains from the perspective of a manager what that means to manage such a company. And they bring this case study of the US bank Capital One. The book's already 20 years old, so I don't know if it's still true of how they conduct their business. But what they describe in there is that Capital One has basically found a way to do exactly what I said with regard to the book Built to Last. So they have an institutionalized process of trying all kinds of business models, and have sort of a process how these little experiments need to progress. They have KPIs with regard to like market penetration, revenue, client feedback, and all that. It's also, it seems to be all quite sophisticated, like based on machine learning and all that. But ultimately, what comes out is that they have found a process, and I have to say, if that is true, that is really something that lots of companies don't have. Is they have found a way, an institutionalized way to identify promising projects and scale them up quickly if they are successful, and roll them out in the entire organization. So, and that is really kind of a good example of what it means to be a learning organization, because it's always, it's much easier to identify something that works or something that's successful. But scaling it up, a lot of companies struggle just because they are in this phase of rigidity, right? Because then if somebody here thinks it's a great idea, there'll be people in 7 other places who find very good reasons why it cannot be done. If you find a way to get around that, and by the way, that's actually in the book Built to Last. Walmart is not a financial institution, but Walmart seems to be the same. They proactively encourage their store manager to try out stuff. And if it works well, they have like a global database where these are collected, and then they are quickly rolled out in the entire network of stores. And I think that is really super interesting. Companies who are empower their people, in the front lines, to be innovative, to try new things without punishing them, which is a virtue in itself. But then kind of go all the way and really scale this in the entire organization. That is really amazing.
And since you talk about rigidity, also I'd like to mention your other article that you wrote named "Why the Theory of Change Needs a Change." Among other things, you wrote that the right role of KPIs is navigation, not deterministic.
Yeah.
This is something you already mentioned a bit, but maybe you'd like to expand on this idea.
Yeah, the transition plan is probably the best example, right? So one perspective, which is the wrong perspective, is okay, emissions is now the KPI that we focus on. And now I'm just mowing down everything to reduce that KPI to the level that I require. Because probably even my bonus depends partially on it. So the KPI becomes the purpose itself. Like reducing the KPIs becomes the purpose. I mean, this is also something I found I could never, even before I knew about complexity economics, I could wrap my head around it because I did have some sympathy for the idea that profit maximization is actually the thing that got us into this whole mess, right? And now we're going to maximize or minimize better so emissions, and that's gonna resolve it. I that just didn't feel right for me. So what you instead should do, what are the hurdles for decarbonization? What are the measures? And then you keep measuring. Maybe they go down, maybe they go up a bit. Then another year they go down. Then 1 year they go massively down. Of course, you gotta look at that number to see where you're going. But it cannot possibly be the idea that the reduction of that number by the percentage that you require becomes the only objective of your being and doing. It is simply a matter of being informed. Judgment, good judgment, still must reign superior. If a measure doesn't make sense because it's commercially not viable or it's unlikely to make contribution in the long run, companies should be allowed to simply say we're not doing that. And yeah, that will have an impact on how the KPI moves year on year, but ultimately our goal is 2030, 2050, right? And not to make sure that every year we're hitting we're staying on the line.
So, for example, if a company says in some industry in the beginning they put this target that in 4 years we want to reduce CO2 by 20%, and then the next year they found out that they can do it in 1 year, then there is no point to keep this plan and they can change it, and the other way around.
Yeah. So then you've achieved it. Well done to you. But then move on, right? So then you can do more, right? That is why decision quality is important, right? Because of course investors will ask themselves, that's really strange. They have this target over 4 years, and after a year they already achieve it. That I think it's absolutely understandable that people think that's a bit strange. That is why the qualitative disclosures are really, really important, and you're thinking around that, and if that is solid, then then maybe something happened, and that allowed you to just make that reduction. I really think that allowing companies to disclose more specifically their own approaches, their thinking, their also disclosing like red lines, right? So for example, openly disclosing decarbonization is important to us, but if it causes harm to social topics, which is conceivable, or if a certain return on investment is not met, then we're not doing it. I think that is fine, because then at least investors can have a mature discussion with companies around whether these red lines are appropriate or not. Or otherwise we are just discussing narratives, whether why you're above or below the line and things like that. And in the end, nobody benefits from that, least of all the companies, because for me, those kind of discussions from a company's perspective are almost like free advice. Like you say, that's how I want to do. Those are my red lines. That's my approach. These I think are the highest hurdles I need to overcome. Maybe an investor comes along and says, "Have you thought about this and that?" Um, or a pension fund, or maybe a client or a supplier comes along and say, "Oh, I understand you're struggling with this. What if we team up? That could actually make sense, because then it's easier for actually both of us to overcome that," and so forth, right? Because if the basis of your decision making is more transparent, then also a much more constructive discussion with all the different stakeholders in the ecosystem can happen. Otherwise, it's all, "Oh, you didn't reduce your footprint. Oh, we need to take you off we need to take you off our preferred supplier list," or stuff like that. I mean, that's just nonsense.
Okay, then finish. Patrick, after the massive loss of clients and the wave of layoffs in sustainability reporting following the regulatory changes, how can professionals be convinced to invest their careers in the sector?
That's an excellent one. um, if you say if sector, I mean, the thing is, if you've worked in sustainability reporting, that is this kind of like when you work in finance or you're an accountant, right? We need to get away from the notion that sustainability is only about sustainability reporting, right? The big action is happening on the ground.
Mhm.
And I guess there have been a lot of people due to the omnibus, due to the regulatory developments, namely CSRD, whose knowledge about sustainability was relatively rather limited to simply knowing the disclosure standards, right? This is like being an expert in IFRS 17 or any other financial disclosure standard, right? Even if you work at a car company, it doesn't. If you're working in accounting, it doesn't mean you're actually you actually have a deep understanding of how a car manufacturer works. The same with sustainability reporting, right? So my perspective on this is that in the spirit of adaptability and resilience, right, the principles I discuss for companies are equally important also for individuals, because of AI and all that. I think how you need to conduct your own professional career is going to change massively. So there's no such thing anymore as being, or it's definitely not advisable to be an expert in one specific area, especially a deep expert. That could be a big risk. So what I would recommend to anybody is diversify your knowledge, right? It is not great to just be an expert in sustainability. Because that's all what I also see in my professional life is before I worked in sustainability, I worked in regulatory advisory and audit, and as part of that, I was able to obtain a very deep understanding of kind of the core processes of a bank, of an asset manager, of an insurance company, which helped me greatly to kind of when the whole sustainability regulations came along, to translate that sustainability term into what does that mean for a lending process? What does that mean for an investment process? And that thinking across disciplines is becoming extremely important, right? So I think if you've worked in sustainability reporting and are currently struggling, right? The way forward is is probably in an area which you've worked before, which is connected to sustainability reporting, or doing something new where you can leverage knowledge you've gained around sustainability. This is super important, mostly for the reason because, and I think that's probably the major message of kind of that underlies all my kind of writing is, sustainability cannot be a separate thing. It needs to be embedded. Kind of a phrase I came up probably after having a few beers was, business is a game and sustainability is about who stays in the game the longest. And therefore you have to get rid of this whole idea that sustainability and profitability and somehow are going in opposite directions. They are not. Specifically how they relate to each other. I was only able to figure out because I drew from knowledge that I had from finance, from regulation, from sustainability, and I was able to make those connections. And that is an ability I also believe is profoundly human, an ability that AI will not be able to do anytime soon. And this is what I would recommend to any sustainability professional, to move out of your comfort zone and bring your knowledge into a new field for the benefit of all.
Patrick, is there anything that you find important, especially regarding decision making under uncertainty we haven't mentioned yet?
Decision making under uncertainty, which we haven't mentioned yet. I have indeed one thing. Decision making under uncertainty has a lot to do with trusting your own organization. You're trusting your own organization to come up with a solution. As a CEO, you don't need to always have the right answers. In fact, there is a citation from the CEO of Walmart. It's also in the book Built to Last. A reporter asks him, "What is your plan regarding that and that development?" And he just says, "I'm sure our people will come up with a solution." And that could come across as lazy and maybe even incompetent if you're a CEO. But there is something, if you can believe what the book found, that there's something fundamental about Walmart is that they empower their people to be close to their clients and be entrepreneurial, and also get not only the freedom to be entrepreneurial, but are encouraged and empowering them. And what this means on a very personal level for you and me working in such an organization is that we need to tolerate other opinions. And that has fundamentally do diversity and inclusion. More like inclusion, right? Because simply having diverse people and diverse opinion is not. There needs to be inclusion. And inclusion can hurt. So there is this experiment from this socio-economist from about 30 years ago. And what he did was they formed 4 groups who worked on a pretty complex task that they needed to complete. And in one of the group, he planted kind of a devil's advocate. So a person who would always go against the rest of the group constructively, but basically say, no, but we haven't considered that. But what about this? And what if we do that, then this happens and that's bad. So why don't we do it like that? That sort of kind of constructive dissent. And it led to that group actually outperforming the others. Now, in a second iteration of the experiment, they asked all the members of the group to vote out one of the members, and in most cases they voted out the devil's advocate, ridding themselves of their competitive advantage, right?
Wow.
And what this proves is that this idiot that you're dealing with in your office, but that keeps bringing up actually pretty valid points. As much as he drives you up the wall, he is an enrichment of your work environment. And and that is really, that's something I keep reminding myself, right? Even if I don't like a person, if I acknowledge, wow, this person really brings something to the table, we really have to get over ourselves. And for me, that is really at the core of this trusting your organization, because organizations where dissent is not tolerated, that can never work. But if you manage to establish a culture and values which value that, which empower people and values dissent, I think you can unleash incredible power in your organization. But it's that goes back to actually doing stuff versus just writing policies, right?
Yeah.
That is so far from how diversity and inclusion was understood, even up to now, right? So that is diversity inclusion that creates really financial value.
I love the way we ended the conversation. And yeah, as I said, I have talking with you, I already have questions, and there were more questions that in my mind, but
Yeah,
it was already very insightful, and
yeah.
grateful for this conversation with you. Would you like to say anything in the end?
Yeah, so happy to cover the other questions in the second iteration.
Yeah,
Yeah.
would be great.
Yeah.
Okay,
No, thanks very much. It was really enjoyable.
Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah.
I wish you an enjoyable day too. Congratulations for listening until the end. You are in the top 25% of listeners. Studies show that we forget up to 70% of what we hear within 24 hours. But when we repeat an insight by sharing it with someone, commenting, or journaling it, it moves into long-term memory. So now tell me, what are your 1 to 3 takeaways you're keeping from this conversation? Enjoy every moment. Until next time.